The evening air in Vienna carried that special kind of magic that only exists in cities where music lives in every corner. The concert had ended just 2 hours ago, and the maestro was still riding that incredible high that comes after performing in front of 2,000 people who hang on every note you play. He'd taken off his formal concert attire in the dressing room, swapped it for jeans and a simple hoodie, and pulled a baseball cap low over his eyes. Sometimes after pouring your soul out on stage, you just need to be nobody for a little while. The hotel lobby was one of those grand European spaces that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. Crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings, marble floors gleamed under warm lighting, and plush velvet chairs were arranged in intimate clusters. But what caught his attention immediately was the piano. A gorgeous Steinway grand piano sat in the corner near the bar area, its polished black surface reflecting the chandelier lights like a mirror. Above it, a small brass sign read, "For our guests, please play." He smiled at that. Hotels with lobby pianos were becoming rare these days, but this one clearly understood something important about music. It wasn't just for concert halls and formal performances. Music was meant to be everywhere, spontaneous and alive. The bar area was fairly crowded for a Tuesday evening. Business travelers in expensive suits nursed whiskeys while checking their phones. A few couples sat close together, speaking in hushed tones over wine. Some tourists were studying maps and guidebooks, planning tomorrow's adventures. And at a corner table, he spotted his tour manager, who'd insisted on meeting him here for a late drink. She caught his eye and waved, but he held up one finger in a give-me-a-minute gesture, because something interesting was happening at the piano. A young woman, probably in her mid-20s, had worked up the courage to sit down at the bench. You could tell she was nervous by the way she adjusted her position 3 times before even touching the keys. Her hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment, and then she began to play. It was Beethoven's Für Elise, probably the most recognized piano piece in the world, the one that almost every beginner learns at some point. She wasn't bad, not really. Her fingers found the right notes most of the time, and she'd clearly practiced this piece many times, but there was a stiffness to her playing, a nervousness that made the music sound mechanical rather than flowing. A few people glanced over politely. One older gentleman nodded approvingly. When she finished, there was a smattering of polite applause from the nearby tables. She stood up quickly, her cheeks flushed, gave a small bow, and hurried back to her table where her friends congratulated her with enthusiastic whispers. The pianist watched all of this with growing amusement. He'd been in her shoes once decades ago, when every performance felt like jumping off a cliff. He remembered that particular mixture of terror and exhilaration. But he also remembered something else from those early days. The absolute certainty that the person sitting next to you at a piano was probably better than you. That intimidating feeling that everyone else knew some secret you hadn't learned yet, and that's when the idea hit him. That mischievous spark that his tour manager would later say she recognized immediately. The kind of idea that was either absolutely brilliant or completely ridiculous. And sometimes those were the same thing. He walked toward the piano with deliberate casualness, hands in his pockets, looking for all the world like someone who'd had a few drinks and decided to embarrass himself in public. A middle-aged couple was just settling into chairs near the piano with their after-dinner coffees. A bartender was mixing cocktails, occasionally glancing toward the instrument with the wary expression of someone who'd heard far too many butchered attempts at Piano Man. As he approached the bench, he made a show of cracking his knuckles loudly. Several people looked over at the sound. He stretched his arms out wide, rolled his shoulders like a boxer preparing for a match, and then sat down with perhaps a bit too much confidence for someone who hadn't even touched the keys yet. His tour manager, watching from across the room, immediately pulled out her phone. She knew that look. She'd worked with him for 7 years, and she could read his moods like a book. When he got that particular gleam in his eye, something memorable was about to happen. She opened her camera app and hit record. The piano bench was at the perfect height, and the keys felt cool and smooth under his fingers as he laid his hands on them for the first time. He could feel their quality immediately. This was a well-maintained instrument, probably tuned regularly, with that perfect responsiveness that only comes from craftsmanship and care. For just a moment, his professional instincts kicked in and he wanted to play something beautiful, something worthy of this magnificent instrument. But no, that would ruin everything. Instead, he chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, Number 2. It's one of the most beloved pieces in the classical repertoire, something that even people who don't listen to classical music recognize when they hear it. Romantic, flowing, deeply emotional. In the right hands, it can make grown men cry. He was about to play it in absolutely the wrong hands. The first notes came out awkward and uncertain. He hit a wrong key almost immediately, then another. His timing was completely off, as if he couldn't quite decide what tempo he wanted to use. The melody that should have flowed like water instead stumbled along like someone walking on a sheet of ice. He hunched his shoulders forward and leaned too close to the keys, the posture of someone who'd learned piano from YouTube videos and never had a proper lesson. The effect was immediate, and exactly what he'd hoped for. The couple with their coffee exchanged a glance. The businessman at the bar, who'd been checking his email, looked up with an expression that rapidly shifted from curiosity to concern. A group of tourists near the entrance actually paused their conversation to stare, not in appreciation but in growing horror. He kept going, making it worse with each measure. He played some notes too hard, others barely whispered. He lost his place and had to start a phrase over, then fumbled the restart. It was the kind of performance that makes music teachers develop involuntary eye twitches, the kind of playing that makes you wonder if the person at the piano has ever actually heard the piece they're attempting to play. The bartender's face was a study in diplomatic distress. You could see him calculating whether it was his responsibility to say something, to perhaps gently suggest that the piano might need a break. A waiter passing by with a tray of drinks actually slowed down, mouth slightly open in disbelief. More people were noticing now. A conversation at a nearby table trailed off mid-sentence. Someone whispered, "Is he serious?" loud enough to be heard. The young woman who'd played for Elise earlier looked both relieved that her performance suddenly seemed much better by comparison, and slightly embarrassed on behalf of this stranger who clearly had no idea how terrible he sounded. The tour manager, still recording, was barely containing her laughter. Her shoulders were shaking with the effort of staying quiet. She knew exactly what was coming next, and the anticipation was almost too much to bear. He continued his massacre of Chopin's masterpiece for another 30 seconds. By now at least a dozen people were openly staring. A few were starting to look around, perhaps hoping a hotel employee would intervene. One elderly gentleman had actually covered his ears with his hands, though he seemed to be doing it as politely as possible. Then, right at the moment when it seemed like someone might actually work up the nerve to ask him to stop, he did stop. Abruptly. He sat up straight, rolled his shoulders back and took a deep breath. His posture completely changed in that instant. The hunched, uncertain amateur disappeared, replaced by something else entirely, something focused and powerful. He placed his hands back on the keys, but this time his positioning was different. Professional. Precise. His fingers curved at exactly the right angle. His wrists were loose but controlled. Even before he played a single note, everything about his posture screamed expertise to anyone who knew what to look for. The lobby had gone very quiet. People were watching now, though most of them probably weren't sure why. There was just something about the way he held himself that made you pay attention. That made you wait for what would happen next. And then his fingers touched the keys again. What came out of that piano in the next moment wasn't Chopin anymore. It was Rachmaninoff. Piano Concerto No. 2, to be specific. And if you know anything about classical piano, you know that's like watching someone struggle to ride a bicycle and then suddenly take off in a fighter jet. The opening notes thundered through the lobby with such power and precision that several people actually jumped. This wasn't just playing anymore. This was something else entirely. The melody soared and dipped, climbed and cascaded, each note placed with such perfect timing and weight that it seemed impossible. They were coming from the same person, who'd been butchering Chopin just seconds ago. His fingers moved across the keys so fast they were almost a blur. Complex runs that would tie most pianists in knots flowed from his hands like water. Octave jumps that require split-second precision landed perfectly every single time. The soft passages were so delicate you could hear people holding their breath to catch every note. The powerful sections made the chandelier crystals tremble just slightly with the vibration. The businessman at the bar had frozen with his whiskey glass halfway to his lips. He'd been about to take a sip when the transformation happened, and now he just stood there, arms suspended in midair, completely forgotten about his drink. His eyes were wide, locked on the figure at the piano, trying to process what his ears were telling him. The couple with their coffee had leaned forward in their chairs, cups completely abandoned on the table. The wife had her hand pressed to her chest over her heart. The husband's mouth had fallen open. They'd come to Vienna for the culture, sure, but they'd expected to find it in museums and concert halls, not in a hotel lobby on a random Tuesday night. More people were gathering now. A waiter had stopped in his tracks, tray balanced on one hand, completely forgetting he was supposed to be delivering drinks to table 7. The hotel receptionist had come out from behind her desk, drawn by the sound. Even the elevator doors opened at one point and the people inside just stood there, not getting out, not pressing any buttons, just listening. The young woman who'd played earlier looked like she'd seen a ghost. She'd returned to her table with her friends and they'd been congratulating her on her courage, but now they all sat in stunned silence. She recognized the piece he was playing. She'd tried to learn it once, years ago, and her teacher had gently suggested that maybe she should wait a few more years. A few more years of lessons, a few more years of practice, maybe a lifetime. It was that kind of piece. The music built and swelled, filled every corner of that grand lobby. It bounced off the marble floors and the high ceilings, swirled around the chandeliers, wrapped around everyone standing there until they felt like they were inside the music, rather than just listening to it. This is what great live music does. It doesn't just enter your ears, it gets inside your chest and squeezes your heart. A group of tourists who'd been heading toward the elevators had stopped in their tracks. They stood with their suitcases still in hand, too captivated to even think about setting them down. One of them, a tall man with a thick mustache, had tears starting to form in his eyes. He wasn't embarrassed by it either. Sometimes beauty hits you that hard. The bartender had given up any pretense of working. He stood with a cocktail shaker in one hand and a bottle of gin in the other, both forgotten, his attention completely absorbed by the performance unfolding in his bar. Later he would tell people that he'd worked in hotels for 20 years, seen all kinds of things, but nothing had ever stopped him in the middle of making a drink before. Not once, not until that night. The pianist kept playing and the piece moved through its emotional journey. Rachmaninoff was a genius at understanding human feelings, at translating them into music. There were passages in this concerto that felt like joy so pure it could break your heart. Other sections felt like longing, like reaching for something just beyond your grasp. And then there were moments of such triumph, such absolute certainty and power, that they made you want to stand up and cheer. His hands moved with absolute confidence across the keys. Left hand providing the rolling, cascading bass lines while the right hand sang out the melody, both hands crossing over each other at times in passages that looked physically impossible. Somehow he made it all look effortless, like this was the most natural thing in the world, like the piano was simply an extension of his own thoughts and feelings, not a separate instrument that needed to be conquered or controlled. A hotel manager had emerged from somewhere in the back offices. He'd heard there was some kind of commotion in the lobby and had come to investigate, probably prepared to politely shut down an impromptu performance that was disturbing the guests. But when he stepped into the lobby and heard what was happening, he stopped cold. He recognized what this was. You don't run a luxury hotel in Vienna without knowing something about music. And this wasn't just good. This was extraordinary. More guests were arriving every second. Someone on the 3rd floor had apparently heard the music through a vent or an open door and came down to investigate. Then they'd called their spouse. Then they'd knocked on their neighbor's door. A small crowd was gathering around the elevator banks now. People in various states of evening dress and casual wear, all of them drawn by the sound of something special happening. The piece moved into a quieter passage, and the pianist's touch became so light and delicate that the notes seemed to float through the air like dandelion seeds on a breeze. This is where technique really shows itself. Not in the loud, flashy parts that impress people at first, but in the soft moments where every single note has to be perfectly controlled. Too hard and you break the spell. Too soft and the note dies before it can speak. He walked that razor's edge with absolute precision. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, had wiggled free from his parents and pushed his way to the front of the growing crowd. He stood there with his hands on the edge of the piano, watching the fingers fly across the keys with the kind of pure, unfiltered amazement that only kids can manage. His mouth hung open, and his eyes tracked back and forth trying to keep up with the movement. Later, his parents would say that was the moment he started begging for piano lessons. The tour manager was still filming, though her hands were shaking slightly now. She'd seen him perform hundreds of times in concert halls all over the world, but there was something different about this, something raw and spontaneous and perfect. This wasn't a scheduled performance. There were no tickets sold, no programs printed, no reviews that would appear in newspapers tomorrow. This was just music for the sake of music, art for the sake of beauty, and somehow that made it even more special. The music built toward what musicians call a climax, not just loud, but emotionally intense, everything coming together in a perfect storm of melody and harmony and rhythm. His whole body moved with the music now, not in a showy way, but in the way that happens when you're so deep inside a piece that the boundary between you and the music starts to blur. His shoulders rose and fell with the breathing of the phrases. His head tilted back slightly during the soaring passages. His eyes were closed, not because he needed to focus on the keys, but because he was somewhere else entirely. A woman near the back of the crowd had pulled out her phone and was trying to record what was happening. But her hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. She kept having to lower the phone and wipe tears from her eyes, then try again. She wasn't alone. All around the lobby, people were experiencing that peculiar thing that happens when something beautiful catches you off guard, when you weren't prepared for it, when you didn't have your emotional defenses up. The tears just come and there's nothing you can do about it. The elderly gentleman who'd covered his ears earlier was now standing just a few feet from the piano, hands clasped in front of him, with an expression on his face like he was witnessing something sacred. His wife had joined him and they stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing this moment without needing to say a single word to each other. The piece moved through another series of technically demanding passages, and the pianist's fingers never faltered, not once, not even slightly. Chords that required stretching an octave and a half landed perfectly. Runs that climbed 3 octaves in less than 2 seconds were clear and even. Transitions between different themes and melodies were seamless. This was what mastery looked like. Not just knowing how to play the notes, but understanding the heart and soul of the music. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God," but it was hard to tell who. The phrase seemed to hang in the air, an expression of awe that probably echoed what everyone else was thinking. Because by now it was becoming clear that something was happening here. This wasn't just a talented amateur. This wasn't even just a very good professional pianist. This was something more than that. The bartender had set down his shaker and bottle at some point and moved closer to the piano. He stood with his arms crossed, not in a defensive way, but in the posture of someone trying to hold themselves together. His eyes were bright, and if you'd asked him later, he would have admitted that yes, he'd cried a little. And no, he wasn't ashamed of it, not even a little bit. The music continued to pour out of that piano, filling the space with such richness and depth that it seemed impossible it was coming from just one instrument. That's what great piano playing does. It sounds like an entire orchestra is hidden inside that wooden box. The bass notes provided the foundation like timpani and cellos. The middle register sang like violins. The high notes sparkled like flutes and piccolos. And somehow, impossibly, one man was playing all of those parts at once. More people kept arriving. Someone had apparently posted something on social media already, because a couple came rushing in from the street, slightly out of breath, looking around frantically, until they spotted the source of the music. They squeezed into a spot near the back of the crowd, and within seconds they too were caught up in the spell. The young woman who'd played for Elise had tears streaming down her face now. Not tears of embarrassment or inadequacy, but tears of joy and recognition. She understood, maybe better than anyone else in that room, what she was witnessing. She knew how many hours of practice went into playing like this, how many years of dedication, how much love for music, and she understood that she was watching someone who had devoted their entire life to this art form, and here he was, sharing it freely in a hotel lobby, not asking for anything in return. The music shifted again, moving into a passage that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The left hand played a steady, rolling pattern while the right hand sang out a melody so achingly beautiful that it seemed to reach into your chest and squeeze. This was the heart of the piece, the emotional center that Rachmaninoff had poured his soul into over 100 years ago, and it was being reborn right here, right now, in this hotel lobby in Vienna. People had stopped trying to be subtle about their reactions. A middle-aged man in an expensive business suit had his head in his hands, shoulders shaking slightly. His colleague had a hand on his shoulder, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the pianist, and her own face was wet with tears. Sometimes grief and beauty and joy all hit you at the same time, and there's nothing you can do but let it happen. The hotel manager stood off to the side, having completely abandoned any thought of asking the performance to stop. He'd pulled out his own phone not to record, but to send a quick message to the rest of his staff. "Get to the lobby, now, you need to see this." Within minutes, housekeepers and bellhops and kitchen staff were emerging from doorways and service corridors, drawn by his urgent message and the sound of the music that filled every corner of the building. The crowd had grown to maybe 60 or 70 people now, packed into the space around the piano. Some stood on tiptoes to see over the heads in front of them. Others had climbed onto chairs and ottomans to get a better view. A few people sat on the floor cross-legged, too absorbed in the music to care about dignity or expensive clothes. The normal sounds of a hotel lobby had completely disappeared. No conversations, no clinking glasses, no rolling suitcase wheels, just the piano and the held breath of everyone listening. The pianist's hands moved through a particularly challenging section, where the melody jumped between the left and right hands so quickly that it created the illusion of two people playing at once. His fingers seemed to dance across the keys, barely touching them, yet each note rang out clear and true. This is what people mean when they talk about making music look easy. It's not that it actually is easy. It's that the difficulty has been practiced away, absorbed into muscle memory and instinct until the technical challenges disappear, and only the art remains. Someone near the back had started to recognize him. She was a music student at the Vienna Conservatory, and she'd been studying recordings of this very piece for her music history class. She'd listened to dozens of interpretations by famous pianists, analyzing their techniques and choices, and something about the way this man played, a particular phrasing in the melody, a specific emphasis on certain notes, was triggering a memory. She pulled out her phone and started frantically typing, searching for something. The music built in intensity again. The pianist leaned into the keyboard, his whole upper body engaged in producing the sound. The bass notes rumbled like thunder. The melody soared overhead like lightning. Together, they created a storm of sound that should have been overwhelming but instead felt glorious, triumphant, like watching someone climb a mountain and plant a flag at the summit. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, had fallen asleep in her father's arms despite the volume of the music, or maybe because of it. Sometimes the most profound things happen when we're young, and they sink deep into our unconscious minds, shaping who we become later. She'd remember this somehow, even if she didn't remember remembering it. That's what moments like this do to us. The tour manager had lowered her phone at some point. She'd gotten plenty of footage, more than enough to capture what was happening. Now she just wanted to experience it fully, to be present in this moment instead of watching it through a screen. She'd been working in the music industry for over a decade, and she'd seen some incredible performances, but this one would stay with her. This was the kind of night you tell your grandchildren about. The music moved through another series of variations, each one showing off a different aspect of the pianist's skill. Here was a passage played with such delicate control that you could hear each individual note shimmering in the air. There was a section where the rhythm drove forward with such momentum that you could feel it in your chest like a heartbeat. And then a quiet moment, almost a whisper, where time seemed to slow down and stretch out. The music student's eyes had gone wide. She'd found what she was looking for on her phone. A picture, a biography, a schedule of performances. "Oh my God," she said out loud, her voice cracking. "That's him. That's actually him." The people around her turned to look, confused. "Who?" someone asked. She just shook her head, unable to form words, and held out her phone to show them. The screen displayed a professional photograph and a name that anyone who followed classical music would recognize instantly. The whisper started to spread through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Person to person, row to row, the recognition moved. "It's him. No, it can't be. Look at the phone. Oh my God, she's right. He was at the Musikverein tonight. I heard it was sold out for months. And he's here? He's right here." But even as people began to realize who was playing, no one interrupted. No one rushed forward demanding autographs or selfies. There was an unspoken understanding that what was happening right now was more important than any of that. This was a gift being offered, and you don't interrupt a gift. You receive it with grace and gratitude. The businessman who'd frozen with his whiskey glass had finally set it down on the bar. His hands were free now, and he used them to wipe his eyes, though he didn't seem embarrassed about it. When you work in finance, spending your days dealing with numbers and spreadsheets and quarterly reports, sometimes you forget that beauty exists in the world. Sometimes you need to be reminded. Sometimes that reminder hits you like a truck. The elderly couple near the front were holding hands now, fingers intertwined. They'd been married for 43 years, and they'd heard a lot of music in that time. They'd been to the opera in Milan. They'd heard jazz in New Orleans. They'd attended chamber music concerts in Prague. But they would both later agree that this, right here, was the most moving musical experience of their lives. Not because it was technically better than everything else, though it was certainly extraordinary, but because it was unexpected. Because it was a gift they hadn't asked for and didn't deserve but were receiving anyway. The piece moved toward what musicians call the recapitulation, where themes from earlier in the work return, but transformed by everything that's happened since. The main melody came back, but now it was richer, deeper, carrying the weight of the entire journey. The pianist played it with such tenderness that it felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. Like watching the sun set on the best day of your life. People in the crowd were making eye contact with strangers and smiling through their tears. There's something about shared experiences of beauty that breaks down the normal barriers between people. You stop being a tourist or a business traveler or a local resident. You're just a human being standing in a room with other human beings, all of you connected by the invisible threads of music. The young boy who'd pushed to the front was sitting on the floor now, cross-legged, his chin resting in his hands. He was utterly still, completely absorbed. His parents had tried to call him back at first, worried he was being rude, but they'd given up. They could see something happening in their son. A door opening, a spark catching fire. They'd talk about this later, about whether they should really invest in piano lessons, whether they could afford a good teacher, whether their small apartment could accommodate an instrument. But right now, they just watched him watch The Pianist, and they understood they were witnessing something important in his young life. The music grew quieter again, more introspective. These were the passages that separated the good pianists from the great ones. Loud and fast are impressive, sure, but they're also easier to hide behind. It's in the quiet moments, the slow moments, where every imperfection shows, where there's nowhere to hide, where the music is so exposed that even the slightest hesitation or miscalculation destroys the spell. The pianist navigated these treacherous waters with absolute confidence, each note floating in the air exactly as long as it needed to, no more and no less. A waiter who'd been standing near the back suddenly understood something. He'd served drinks to this man earlier, before the concert. He'd been sitting at a corner table alone, looking at some sheet music. The waiter had thought he seemed familiar but hadn't placed him. Now it all clicked together. He'd literally served whiskey to one of the greatest living pianists just a few hours ago, and had no idea. He let out a small laugh at the absurdity of it, drawing a few glances from people nearby. The hotel receptionist was crying openly now, not even trying to hide it. She'd had a rough day. A difficult guest had complained about everything. The computer system had crashed twice. Her feet hurt from standing for 8 hours. She'd been counting down the minutes until her shift ended. And then this had happened. This reminder that there's more to life than computers and complaints and tired feet. This reminder that the world contains moments of transcendent beauty if you're just paying attention. The music built one final time toward its conclusion. The pianist's hands flew across the keys in patterns that seemed impossibly complex. Multiple melodies weaving together, bass and treble conversing like old friends who finish each other's sentences. The volume grew, the intensity increased, and yet he never once pounded or forced the sound. Even at its loudest, the music remained controlled, shaped, intentional. That's mastery. That's decades of practice paying off in ways that most people can't even comprehend. The crowd seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing that the end was approaching. Some people had their hands clasped in front of them as if praying. Others had their hands over their mouths, trying to hold in the sobs that threatened to escape. The little girl who'd been asleep stirred slightly in her father's arms, perhaps sensing the energy in the room even in her dreams. The final chord was approaching. You could feel it in the air, in the tension of the room, in the way the music seemed to be gathering itself for one last statement. The pianist's hands were positioned, ready, and then with perfect timing and weight he brought them down on the keys for the final time. The chord rang out, full and rich and satisfying, then slowly faded into silence. He held his hands on the keys even after the sound had died away, head bowed as if unwilling to break the spell too quickly. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence was as profound as the music had been. It stretched out thick and heavy, and in that silence you could feel 70 people all processing the same overwhelming experience, trying to find their way back to normal reality from wherever the music had taken them. And then the lobby exploded. The applause wasn't just loud. It was thunderous. It was the kind of applause that shakes the walls and rattles the windows. People weren't just clapping, they were cheering, shouting, whistling. Some were stamping their feet. Others were pounding on tables and chairs. It was the kind of reception you'd expect at the end of a major concert. Not in a hotel lobby on a Tuesday night. The pianist stood up from the bench and turned to face the crowd. And for the first time since he'd started playing, he was smiling. Not a small, polite smile, but a huge, genuine grin that lit up his entire face. He looked happy. Not proud or smug or self-satisfied, just purely, simply happy. Happy to have played. Happy to have shared this with people. Happy to exist in this moment. Someone started chanting, "Bravo," and within seconds the entire crowd had taken it up. "Bravo, bravo, bravo!" The sound echoed off the high ceilings. The hotel manager was clapping so hard his hands had to be hurting. The bartender was whistling with his fingers in his mouth, the way people do at sports games. The elegant, refined atmosphere of the European luxury hotel had been completely abandoned in favor of pure, unfiltered enthusiasm. People surged forward, and for a second it looked like it might become chaotic, but the pianist held up his hands in a friendly gesture that seemed to say, "Hold on, hold on." The crowd stopped, though they kept applauding, kept cheering. He was still grinning, clearly enjoying their reaction, but also seeming slightly overwhelmed by it. The music student who'd recognized him was trying to push through the crowd, but she'd gone weak in the knees and had to stop and lean against a pillar. She'd studied his recordings for 3 years. She'd written a paper about his interpretation of romantic composers. She had his albums on her phone and listened to them while she practiced. And he'd been right here, 10 feet away from her, and she'd watched him go from playing badly on purpose to revealing himself as a master. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. A man near the front, the one in the expensive business suit who'd been crying earlier, stepped forward and held out his hand. The pianist shook it warmly. No words were exchanged, but the look on the businessman's face said everything. "Thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for reminding me that beauty exists." The pianist nodded, understanding completely, and squeezed the man's hand. More people were pushing forward now, all wanting that same moment of connection. The pianist shook hands, accepted hugs, posed for photos with people who could barely speak through their tears and smiles. He was gracious with every single person, giving each interaction his full attention, never rushing anyone, even though there were dozens more waiting. The young woman who'd played for Elise at the start of all this had finally worked up the courage to approach. She looked terrified. When she reached the front of the crowd, she opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She tried again, failed again. The pianist seemed to understand her struggle. He smiled at her, and there was such warmth and kindness in that smile that her terror melted away. "You played beautifully earlier," he said to her, and his voice was gentle and sincere. "Never stop practicing. Never stop playing. The world needs more people who love music enough to share it." She burst into tears, not sad tears, but the kind of tears that come when someone who represents everything you aspire to be tells you that you're on the right path. She managed to stammer out a "thank you" before being gently moved aside by the press of other people wanting their moment. The tour manager had made her way to his side and was trying to run interference, making sure he didn't get completely overwhelmed. But he seemed energized by the crowd's reaction, feeding off their enthusiasm. Someone asked him why he'd played so badly at first, and he laughed out loud. "I wanted to see your faces," he said. "I wanted to see that moment when everything changes. When people realize they were wrong about what they thought was happening." He spread his hands, encompassing the crowd. "Did you feel it? That moment when you understood?" The crowd laughed and nodded and called out variations of yes. Oh yes, they'd felt it. They'd felt it right down to their bones. The elderly couple who'd been holding hands had waited patiently at the edge of the crowd. When they finally got close enough, they didn't ask for a photo or an autograph. The wife simply said, That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Her husband nodded in agreement, too emotional to speak. The pianist took both of their hands in his and said, "Thank you for listening. Really listening. That's all any musician can ask for." The young boy who'd been sitting cross-legged on the floor had been pulled back by his parents, who were apologizing for their son's behavior, for him sitting so close, for being in the way. The pianist waved off their concerns and knelt down to the boy's level. "Do you play piano?" he asked. The boy shook his head shyly. "No, but I want to. I want to play like you." "Then you will," the pianist said firmly. "If you want it enough, if you work hard enough, you will. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But one day you'll sit at a piano and music will come out and it will be the best feeling in the world." He ruffled the boy's hair. "Promise me you'll remember this feeling. This excitement. When the practice gets hard and your hands hurt and you want to quit, remember how you felt tonight." The boy nodded solemnly, taking this responsibility seriously. His parents thanked the pianist, their eyes shining with tears and gratitude and the sudden realization that their lives had just gotten more expensive because they were absolutely buying their son a piano now. Someone in the crowd shouted out, "Why here? Why not just do concerts?" The pianist stood up and addressed the whole crowd. "Because this is real," he said. "This is what music is supposed to be. Not tickets and programs and reviews, just people and sound and emotion. I've played in the greatest concert halls in the world and they're magnificent, but there's something about this." He gestured around the lobby. Something about the spontaneity, the surprise, the shared experience with people who weren't expecting it. This is why I became a musician, not for the fame or the money or the prestige, for this, for these moments when music connects human beings to each other. The crowd had gone quiet again, listening intently. His words carried weight because they were clearly coming from a place of deep sincerity. "Plus," he added with a mischievous grin, "it's really fun to play badly on purpose and watch people squirm." The lobby erupted in laughter. The tension broke and suddenly everyone was talking and laughing and wiping their eyes and sharing their experience with the people around them. Strangers were exchanging phone numbers, promising to send each other the videos they'd recorded. The businessman was showing photos to the bartender. The music student was frantically posting on social media, trying to capture what had happened in words even though she knew it was impossible. The tour manager managed to pull him aside for a moment. "You know the video I took is going to go viral, right?" she said. "This is going to be everywhere by tomorrow." He shrugged. "Good, let it. Maybe it will inspire more people to play music. Maybe it will remind people to pay attention to the beautiful things happening around them. Maybe someone watching will decide to learn an instrument or go to a concert, or just slow down and really listen to something instead of just hearing it." She smiled and shook her head. "You're impossible. You know that." "I prefer incorrigible," he replied with a grin. More people kept coming over and he kept greeting them all warmly. A couple mentioned they'd been at his concert earlier that evening at the Musikverein. They'd paid €200 each for tickets and had thought that was the musical highlight of their Vienna trip. Now they weren't so sure. This impromptu performance in a hotel lobby might have topped it. The hotel manager had finally made his way through the crowd. He looked like he didn't know whether to thank the pianist or apologize for all the chaos. He settled on thanking him. "Sir, that was extraordinary, truly extraordinary. I've run this hotel for 15 years and I've never seen anything like that. Would you consider playing here again? We could arrange a proper event, invite people, make it official." The pianist considered this for a moment, then shook his head gently. "That's kind of you, but no. What made tonight special was that it wasn't official. It wasn't planned. It was just a moment that happened because I was in the right place at the right time with the right instrument. If we tried to recreate it, it wouldn't be the same." The manager nodded, understanding even though he looked disappointed. "Well, sir, whenever you're in Vienna, you have a room here, complimentary, for life. It's the least we can do. I'll take you up on that," the pianist said with a smile. "Though I have to say the real star tonight was your piano. That's a magnificent instrument. You take good care of it?" The manager beamed with pride. "We have it tuned every month. It's one of our treasures." The crowd was slowly beginning to disperse, though no one seemed to want to leave. People lingered in small groups, talking animatedly about what they'd just witnessed, trying to process the experience together. The normal sounds of the hotel were gradually returning. Glasses clinking at the bar, elevator bells dinging, the soft murmur of conversation. But everything felt different now, charged with an energy that hadn't been there an hour ago. The pianist had finally managed to extract himself from the crowd and was heading toward the table where his tour manager had been sitting all along. He dropped into the chair across from her with a satisfied sigh. She pushed a whiskey toward him, which he accepted gratefully. "You're absolutely insane," she said, but she was smiling. "You know that, right?" "I prefer spontaneous go," he replied, taking a sip of the whiskey. "Besides, when was the last time you saw me have that much fun?" She considered this. Fair point. Though I have to say, the looks on people's faces when you switched from playing badly to playing Rachmaninoff, that's going to stay with me forever. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the lobby slowly return to normal, except it wasn't really normal anymore, and it probably never would be again, not for the people who'd been there tonight. Within an hour, the videos started appearing online. First from his tour manager's official account, but then from dozens of other people who'd been in the lobby. Each video captured a slightly different angle, a different perspective on the same magical moment. The views started climbing immediately. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. By morning, the video had been shared across every major social media platform. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. People who'd been there tagged their friends. Those friends shared it with their friends. Music lovers found it. People who didn't even particularly like classical music found it. Within 24 hours, the view count was in the millions. The comments section was extraordinary. Thousands upon thousands of people sharing how the video had affected them. I got actual chills. I'm crying at my desk at work. This is why I love music. I've watched this 17 times, and it gets better every time. My daughter saw this and asked for piano lessons. I don't even like classical music, but this is beautiful. News outlets picked up the story. Music blogs wrote articles. The video appeared on morning talk shows. Everyone wanted to know more about this pianist who'd pranked a hotel lobby into experiencing transcendent art. His record label saw a massive spike in album sales. Streaming numbers for his recordings jumped by 400% in a single week. But the real impact wasn't in the numbers or the viral fame. It was in the lives that were changed by what happened that night. The young woman who'd played for Elise went home and practiced for 3 hours straight, fired up by his encouragement. She'd been thinking about quitting lessons, about giving up on music because she'd never be good enough. Now she understood that being good enough wasn't the point. Playing, sharing, loving the music, that was the point. 6 months later, she'd perform in her first recital, and she'd play with a confidence she'd never had before. The little boy got his piano lessons. His parents found a good teacher, sacrificed some of their budget to afford it, and watched their son throw himself into learning with a passion they'd rarely seen in him. He practiced every day without being asked. 2 years later, he'd play in a school concert, and afterward he'd tell his parents that he remembered that night in the hotel. He remembered the promise he'd made. The businessman went home that night and pulled out the dusty guitar that had been sitting in his closet for 15 years. He'd stopped playing after college, got too busy with work, convinced himself he didn't have time for hobbies. He spent 2 hours that night relearning chords his fingers had forgotten, and it felt like coming home. Music became part of his life again. Not professionally, not even very well, but it was there, a reminder that he was more than his job title. The elderly couple talked about that night for months afterward. They told their children about it, their grandchildren, anyone who would listen. It became one of their favorite stories, right up there with the story of how they met and the birth of their first child, a moment of pure beauty that they'd experienced together. The hotel noticed a change too. Guests started requesting the rooms with the best view of the lobby piano. People would linger in the bar area, hoping for another spontaneous performance. The hotel manager had a small brass plaque made and mounted near the piano, commemorating the night without being too explicit about it. On this piano, magic happened, it read simply. The music student used the experience as the foundation for her senior thesis on the role of spontaneity in classical music performance. She argued that the increasing formality and structure of classical concerts was creating a barrier between artists and audiences, and that moments like that night in Vienna showed the power of breaking down those barriers. Her thesis won an award. She'd go on to become a music educator, always encouraging her students to find opportunities to play outside concert halls, to surprise people, to remember that music belongs to everyone. But perhaps the most interesting change happened online in the broader culture. The video sparked something. A conversation about art and accessibility and the role of beauty in everyday life. People started sharing their own stories of unexpected artistic moments. A dancer performing in a subway station. A singer doing an impromptu concert in a park. A painter creating a mural on a building wall. The hashtag that emerged became filled with examples of art breaking free from galleries and concert halls and finding people where they were. Other musicians started doing similar things. Inspired by the video, they began showing up in unexpected places and giving surprise performances. A famous violinist played at a bus stop. A cellist performed in a shopping mall. A vocal ensemble surprised travelers at an airport. Not all of these went as well as that night in Vienna, but they all shared the same spirit. The idea that art shouldn't be something you have to seek out in special places at special times. That beauty could and should be a regular part of life. The pianist himself was bemused by all the attention. He'd done impromptu performances before, though none had been caught on video like this one. In interviews, he tried to redirect the focus away from himself and toward the larger point. "I'm not special," he'd say. "Any musician could do this. Any artist of any kind could do this. The point isn't me or my skill level. The point is that we should be looking for opportunities to surprise people with beauty, to break them out of their routines and remind them that there's more to life than whatever they were worried about 5 minutes ago." When asked about the prank element, about playing badly on purpose, he'd laugh. That was just to make it fun, to create a story. But honestly, the transformation from bad to good is kind of a metaphor, isn't it? It's about not judging too quickly, not writing something off because it doesn't immediately impress you. Sometimes you have to stick around, pay attention, give things a chance to reveal themselves. The tour manager made sure the original video stayed up on all platforms, despite several record labels wanting to monetize it differently. "This belongs to everyone now," she said in a meeting with executives. "This isn't about making money. This is about keeping something beautiful in the world." They grumbled but eventually agreed, and the video remained free and accessible to anyone who wanted to watch it. Years later, people would still be talking about that night. It became one of those stories that gets told and retold, sometimes with embellishments, sometimes simplified, but always carrying the same essential truth. A famous pianist walked into a hotel lobby and decided to give the gift of music to a bunch of strangers who weren't expecting it.